I'm delighted, truly delighted to welcome you to the first, or one of the first CACR sessions in person, certainly one of the first for this academic year. We're coming out of what was Zoom CACR speaker series into an in-person one. Joe Tomain is walking in. He's just taught contract. Joe Tomain and I will share moderating privileges on this because I will have to leave towards the end to teach torts. That's the menacing part of law school. But I'm truly delighted to have Chinmayi Sharma and Ellen Rozenshtein coming to speak to us today. Let me give you a brief introduction on each of them. Each of them will present a different project, but both have some tying, which they'll talk about. So Chinmayi Sharma is a scholar in residence at the Strauss Center and a lecturer at the University of Texas School of Law. She was previously in private practice at Harris, Wiltshire, and Grannis, where she focused on spectrum policy, privacy, and cybersecurity. She's a regular contributor to Lawfare, and prior to law school, she founded a company building custom software solutions. She will be presenting to us a paper titled The Tragedy of the Digital Commons, Open Source Security, and Critical Infrastructure. Ellen Rozenshtein, we'll speak after her, is an associate professor of law at the University of Minnesota Law School, a senior editor at Lawfare, and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He previously served as an attorney advisor of the Office of Law and Policy in the National Security Division of the Department of Justice, where he focused on cybersecurity and foreign intelligence issues. He will be presenting to us a project titled Moderating the Fediverse, Content Moderation on Distributed Social Media. Each of them will take about 15 minutes to present their project, then we'll open it up to some questions. With that, I'll leave it to you, Chinmayi.
So our projects are quite different, but they fall under the theme of the security of open platforms. And that's kind of a broad category of technology. But the reason we think it's really relevant is because we've seen a large shift internationally towards exploring open technology solutions. Everything from the EU's push for data portability and more open APIs to here the rise of blockchain and decentralized ways of approaching things like payment and digital identification. My paper will be focused primarily on open source code. Alan's paper will focus more on kind of the push towards decentralization. So my project started with an interest in the amount of open source code that is out there, the importance it plays in society, and how little I hear people talk about it, both in the tech sector and especially in the legal and policy sectors. So on December 9th, 2021, a lot of people's holiday season was horribly disrupted when a Chinese researcher identified and disclosed a major vulnerability in a very popular open source library. I'm not sure if some of you heard of this in the news, but this was Log4j. Log4j was an exploitable vulnerability that would allow attackers to gain full access to systems. And they often used these systems to do ransomware, to mine for Bitcoin, but essentially it would just compromise and potentially take offline very important networks. By some estimates, 1 in 10 digital assets were vulnerable. This means phones, laptops, your smart fridge, your baby monitor, a lot of different devices that are connected to the network. The United States alone was hit with 10 million attempted exploits per hour. It's a large amount. And those were just attempts. Internationally, estimates suggest that nearly 1/2 of global corporate networks experienced successful exploits in the first 5 days following the vulnerability's discovery. Companies like Apple, Amazon, Cloudflare, IBM, they began experiencing a barrage of attempted attacks, and they had no choice but to begin systematically shutting down their systems. They did not know where Log4j was because it was a very deeply embedded open source library. It was not popular, it was not familiar to people, it was not top of mind. And so the process started with looking for it, but it would take time to look for it. So to prevent the exploitation, they just shut systems down. That's one thing from a corporate sector, but it's also impacted governments. For example, the Belgian and Canadian governments had to shut down parts of their government for fear of exploitation for Log4j. Since December, it has been confirmed that Chinese hackers have been using Log4j to attack state governments in the US and have taken state governments offline in some instances. Iran, North Korea, and Turkey are also suspected of exploiting this vulnerability. CISA Director Jen Easterly has called this the most serious vulnerability she has seen in her entire career. The CVSS criticality score of this, which assesses the severity of a vulnerability, had it at 10 out of 10. Now, although the Log4 shell vulnerability was first disclosed in December, it has existed in the code since 2013. That means the threat was present long before we knew to look for it. The Cyber Safety Review Board, which was erected by the Biden administration to specifically investigate incidents like this, ultimately determined that this was a preventable incident. The vulnerability could have been found earlier. However, the Apache developers, who are notably volunteers, which we will talk more about later, did not have the resources at their disposal to do the vulnerability scanning and security measures that would have found this out. And that is the crux of this talk. The resource and support gap that is not only preventing open source from realizing its full potential, it is also seriously undermining the security of our critical systems and infrastructure. So just some background on Log4j. Log4j, as I mentioned, is a deeply embedded library that is part of Apache. Apache is a very popular open source library. Some studies show that 1/3 of international web servers use Apache. This is supported by the Apache Foundation, which is a nonprofit. What is most notable here is that every developer under the Apache Foundation is an unpaid volunteer. So Log4j was maintained by unpaid volunteers. Despite the fact that they are unpaid volunteers, they developed and distributed patches in record time, faster than many commercial entities would have been able to do so. So what this shows is that this isn't an open source problem. There is something deeper going on here. So yeah, we might think Log4j happened, that was last December, we've moved on, what's the problem? It's not over. To start, hackers are still exploiting Log4j today. More than half a year later, 60% of the hundreds of millions of affected devices remain unpatched. This is still a very real and present threat. Everything from smart devices to commonly used software. Often many companies don't even know that they still have Log4j there and so don't know to patch it. Many might know that they have Log4j and choose not to patch it. And the situation is not anomalous. Equifax, famously known as one of the worst data breaches in history, was caused by an unpatched open source vulnerability. What this means is the vulnerability was known, the patch was developed, but Equifax just chose not to implement it. So why is this happening? Largely, I posit, because of irresponsible software vendors. And by software vendors, I mean the private companies that build and sell commercial software that incorporates open source code. I think and have studied and found that they fail to do the absolute bare minimum in security measures, which is to implement a patch that someone else built and has been delivered for free. This means that they're selling products to consumers whose integrity cannot be assured. A study found that 85% of software, as a representative sample of software internationally, contained components that were more than 4 years outdated. That means for 4 years, vulnerabilities were known, patches had been developed, but those systems remained vulnerable. And so the entire time, customers remained vulnerable to exploits. This underlying issue of vendor irresponsibility is not going away. So why does this matter? Because the fallout of Log4j and Equifax demonstrate the immense impact of open source exploits, even when the vulnerability is in a lesser known project. While Log4j is not considered the most important, critical project out there, it ended up being one of the most ubiquitous projects out there. While it wasn't front of mind or actively being used by companies, all of them had them in their systems because many used Apache and imported Log4j, whether they knew it or not. So the potential harm is enormous. But some might ask, yes, the harm is enormous, but maybe this is anomalous. Maybe the probability of this is very low. But in fact, the probability of these kinds of events is quite high. The risk surface for open source is extremely vast. Approximately 97% of all software out there internationally contains some amount of open source code. In fact, it's not a negligible amount of code. About 78% of that code on average is open source. So the majority of code in the software that we use every day is open source. The volume is large, but the diversity of software in open source software being used is small. All of that open source that I talked about largely comes from probably a handful of important and popular open source projects. This creates redundancies, and these redundancies have multiplier effects. Every discrete instance of a project is an exposed vulnerability. It is one opportunity for a bad actor to find a vulnerability to exploit. Once that happens, every other instance where that code exists is then exposed to exploit. Attackers know this. Attacks specifically targeting open source have increased 650% over just 1 year. Okay, so yes, maybe if we have open source exploits, we'll lose our access to Google for a bit. Maybe AWS will go down. It'll be really inconvenient. I won't be able to access Slack at work. I won't be able to update my Instagram, but we'll probably live. But what if we lost access to safe water supply? What if a hospital, even temporarily, lost access to patient files? That would be life-threatening. More than half of all code in our critical infrastructure is still open source. So how is this an open source problem and not just a software problem generally? Now, software has security problems throughout. Vendors are not taking the measures required to secure their software. However, proprietary software is governed by unique incentives and institutions that cannot be leveraged by open source because it has unique public good characteristics. So what's my point? Open source is not the problem. It provides immeasurable value. There's no evidence that it is actually less secure than proprietary software. We should not move away from it because of the benefits it provides. Even if we wanted to move away from it, we couldn't because it is so deeply embedded in our digital infrastructure. Countries worldwide, from China to the EU, have recognized this and are dedicating time, effort, resources, and expertise to solving this problem. We must follow suit, and this can't happen without government intervention. So I want to talk a little bit about open source's public good characteristics. But first, I want to address how open source is critical infrastructure. The reason we care is because open source is providing the support required for our most life-giving functions. Our day-to-day activities, our water supplies, our energy grid, our defense industry are all fueled by open source. CISA defines critical infrastructure as functions and assets that are so vital to the United States that its incapacity or destruction would have a debilitating impact on our physical or economic security or public health and safety. Open source more than fits the bill. Over 90% of software in critical infrastructure systems contains open source. And again, it is not a negligible amount. On average, 3/4 of the code in that software is open source. So if open source went away overnight, our critical infrastructure would collapse. So part of the problem, part of the reason it's not easy to solve this is because open source has public good characteristics. As a brief overview, a public good is something that is non-excludable and non-rivalrous. I cannot prevent someone else from accessing it, and my accessing it will not interfere with someone else's ability to access it. But it is important to remember here that open source code or open source generally is comprised of two things: the code itself, but also the maintainers that support it. Now, the code might be a pure public good. It is non-excludable and non-rivalrous. However, the maintainers are not a pure public good. They are an impure public good. They are non-excludable. I cannot opt out of the benefits of the fact that some people are maintaining open source. But the open source maintenance is somewhat rivalrous. To allow a public good to continue to be non-rivalrous, you need to invest in maintenance. For example, a road is often used as an example for a public good. My going to work on a highway is not going to prevent you from going to work on a highway. However, overuse of that road would lead to potholes and other kinds of circumstances that would make the road eventually unusable, which is why regular maintenance of roads, however effective that might be, is required. The same is true for open source. Open source is being overused, but the amount of maintenance, the supply of maintenance has not been grown with the amount of use that is now happening. We need to ramp up the amount of available maintenance to match the popularity of open source today. The reason that's not happening is because only one half of the equation is putting any effort into this. There are two parties responsible for maintaining open source: the open source maintainers themselves, who are building and monitoring the code and making sure it remains secure and useful. But the other party is the users, the beneficiaries of open source. They have a responsibility to review their code for security, for vulnerabilities, to communicate that upstream to the maintainers, to develop the patches, to distribute the patches to their customers. If they do not do that, they are exposing the rest of the ecosystem to risk, and they're making the job of protecting against that risk even harder for maintainers. They're making the security problem worse. Think of this as the drivers on a road. The drivers have a responsibility to make sure that they are not exceeding the weight limit on a bridge, or they do not have an oil leak that could cause a pileup, or if they see a massive pothole, they report it. There is a responsibility from both sides to make sure that this public good continues to be supplied from a maintenance perspective. So I can go on and on about the various market failures that come out of this. There's a free rider problem. Open source is free. People will continue to use it because there's no reason to put money into something that you can get for free. What this causes is externalities for the public. Ultimately, the risk to one given company of a vulnerability is I might face a breach, and I might have to pay for what happens with that breach. But the vulnerability to society is 100-fold. That one project that might impact that one company is also a project that is used by hundreds of other entities across critical infrastructure, and now they are all exposed. And that exposure hurts us as the public, but those are externalities that are not being internalized. Part of the challenge of solving this problem is another market failure, which is asymmetric information. Open source, the code itself, is very transparent. It's public, it's out there. But ironically, the ecosystem is very opaque. It is hard to know who is using open source, where they are using it, how much they are using it. It is hard to value open source to see which projects are most important, where should we funnel our resources, which projects are more insecure, who are the worst free riders out there. So ultimately what this will result in is the tragedy of the commons problem, which happens when there is a good that is non-excludable, but somewhat rivalrous, and people are acting in their own best interest, which will ultimately lead to the depletion of that resource. This is a coordination failure, because if all parties acted in the public's interest, the burden of security would be minimized if shared equally. But this is like an elaborate game of chicken, where no one wants to take the first step, no one wants to coordinate, they want to continue to free ride off of the efforts of others. And so my proposal here is that the government has to step in. The government has always played a very important role in solving public good market failures. This is an incentive problem. The status quo will not change because there is no reason for the players in this space to want the status quo to change because it serves them. the government needs to step in and change the incentive structure. The government also has a unique ability to solve the coordination problem, whether through coercive measures or just additional incentives and encouragement. They need to bring together public-private partnerships to solve this asymmetric information problem. So we can understand what are the projects that are most critical out there, what are the projects that need the most resource and support, and then ultimately they need to provide the support that is required. And then finally, I suggest that we need to impose liability on software vendors. These are the vendors that are shrugging the responsibility that they have to do their part in maintaining open source, of doing their security checks, to helping maintainers, to not put more burden on maintainers, increasing their workload, and eventually making open source more insecure.
Look, you got some questions in the chat. I also have some questions for you, and I'm debating what you prefer. If you want to take a question or two now, do you want to? Yeah, so why don't we take two questions now, and then we'll move to Alan. I'll ask one question from the chat and one of my own, taking the moderator prerogative a little bit here. One thing that I'm really interested in is the intersectionality of everything you're talking about and the vulnerabilities equities process, the VAP. That is the process by which the government hoards vulnerabilities for its own purposes and refuses to share vulnerabilities that are identified with the government, with the private sector. It is precisely in the open source, for all the reasons that you correctly identified, that some governments find the best kind of vulnerabilities to utilize. And in particular, vulnerabilities that they feel are safer to continue to hoard because they are patchable or patched. And so they can ensure the particular critical infrastructure, they might nudge, wink, wink to them, hey, you need to fix this, while keeping it open for their utilization in other places where they might want to gather intelligence. And so is it our interest to completely shut the vulnerabilities in the ecosystem here or not? And how do you intersect?
That's where a lot of nuance comes into this. Not all vulnerabilities are bad. Not all vulnerabilities need to be patched. There are vulnerabilities out there that are relatively innocuous, and the effort put into patching them is probably not worth it. That requires a very thorough and informed analysis that prioritizes vulnerabilities. CISA is working on the VEX program that is going to essentially encourage software vendors who are best positioned to do this to prioritize which vulnerabilities they think their customers need to focus on. But to the VEP point, ironically, the VEP came out of an open source vulnerability. OpenSSL was a big open source project that secured 2/3 of the world's website at one point. It was the cryptographic protocol that makes the website HTTPS instead of HTTP. That had a vulnerability. It was exploited. It was very bad. The concern or the conspiracy theory was that the government had known about it and had told no one. And if they had told someone, this could have been patched earlier and all of the harm could have been avoided. The VEP was actually built in response to that, in the hopes that now when the government finds out about these vulnerabilities, some kind of collaborative process happens to share it with some entities and to make a collective decision on whether we stockpile this or share it more broadly. The problem with that, and the problem with a lot of government efforts so far, is open source is not at the table. The vendors are at the table, the big companies at the table, but the maintainers are not at the table. And these are the individuals that are the ultimate source of truth for these projects. They're the ones that they are craving this business intelligence to understand who is using their code, how important it is to those entities, and who knows about vulnerabilities that they could be solving.
I will say to you, I think that there's a follow-up to your project that deals specifically with whether or not our existing VAP process takes open source factors into account, or at least a blog post.
I will say, as someone who spent 2 years in government sitting in VEP meetings, I wish I could defend the VEP's honor, but I can't, and also it's all classified.
Yeah. There was one question in the chat, which is, so in the wake of the ransomware on the Colonial Pipeline, the government has responded to cybersecurity for critical infrastructure by legislating the Cyber Incident Notification Law, which mandates reporting obligations. So the primary tool that the government has so far taken with addressing breaches to critical infrastructure was reporting. And the question that was asked is whether or not you think that is part of the toolbox? Could it change behavior of leaders within these companies?
I think that's really interesting. I think there's a lot of controversy around the incident reporting requirement, and specifically with Colonial Pipeline, there was evidence that came out that unless the FBI had pushed as hard as it did, they had no interest in disclosing that information to the government. I think the problem here is twofold. One, you might require critical infrastructure entities to disclose these incidents to CISA, but part of the safe harbor there is that if you disclose that to the government, the fact of that disclosure is protected from liability because we want to encourage that disclosure from a general understanding the threat landscape. The second part of that is, again, open source is not notified about this. A lot of these disclosures are made anonymously. The system through which the disclosures are made was built to be anonymous. And so that information is not pushed back upstream to the developers. And so, I mean, part of the individuals that need to have an access into the ecosystem are the developers themselves. So I don't think that fixes the whole problem.
Yeah. Awesome. So we're going to switch gears. Keep any questions you have for Chinmayi percolating, because we're going to come back and open it up for the both of them. But moving to Alan, who will present about moderating the Fediverse.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you all. So yeah, this is also security on open platforms, with a very different kind of security and very different kinds of open platforms. But we can think about the commonalities between sort of the issues that Chinny and I are talking about. So this is based on a short work that's coming out in a forthcoming edited volume on content moderation. If you'd like to read the draft, it's on my SSRN page. You can just Google my name and SSRN and it will pop up. And my chapter is exploring how a different and emerging model for social media, decentralized or federated platforms, generally called the Fediverse in the industry, as the young people say, might help provide a better basis for content moderation. And interestingly, there's some nice current events hook. Actually, 2 days ago, Jack Dorsey, who's the head of, who's the founder of Twitter, he has been working, or he has been supporting a project called Blue Sky, which is basically a Twitter-funded attempt to develop a decentralized social media protocol. And they just kind of announced that they're ready to put out the protocol 2 days ago. So it's a nice moment. Now, Blue Sky doesn't actually exist, or rather, there are no Blue Sky applications operating. So it's kind of hard to evaluate whether Blue Sky will work. But fortunately, there is an existing decentralized protocol and decentralized platforms that operate on that. ActivityPub is the protocol, and Mastodon is the most famous of these platforms. And so that gives us kind of an attempt so we can see, well, did these work, and what lessons might we learn for this new project? Because of course, if Twitter is supporting this, and if one day, especially if Twitter runs on this, oh, God knows what will happen if Elon Musk, the whole thing is totally unclear, right? But if Twitter runs it, it'll be a very, very big deal. So that's a nice current events hook. Now, let me try to frame my discussion just by reference to how we think about content moderation today. So a lot of the current very important discussion about this issue thinks about ways in which the major social media companies can do a better job, right? Either voluntarily, as with Facebook's Supreme Court, or through different kinds of government mandates, right? Directly, that's what Europe wants to do. Indirectly, that's what our Section 230 debate is about. But all of these discussions assume that, at least for the future or the foreseeable future, the model is going to be these big social media companies, these big closed platforms, right, that control their own operations. But what if the very structure, and this is, I think, the things motivating the Fediverse and Blue Sky, for example, as well, what if the very structure of current social media is a big part of the content moderation challenge, right? What if the very fact that you have centralized control over a large number of users, that these users have very little control over the content moderation policies that are going on, the fact that these moderation policies have to be uniform across the whole world, because if you're going to have one platform, that's what it's going to be. What if it's the architecture itself that is causing some of these problems that we then squint at the architecture to solve? And is there a way, right, to get out of that architecture? Now, I think one reason to think that the answer to both of these answers is yes, or kind of prima facie reason, is to think about email, right? Which is kind of, in some sense, one of the original decentralized communications platforms. Now, obviously, it's not that email doesn't have content moderation challenges, right? There's spam, there's child exploitation material, there's all sorts of, there's all sorts of crap on email. Yet we don't generally talk about the email content moderation, quote unquote, crisis. And it might be useful to think why. Well, I think that there are kind of two reasons. First, and I think this is the most important reason, you can't censor email, right? There's just no way to centrally moderate email. Now, obviously, email servers can moderate the information. I use Gmail. I think a lot of us use Gmail. They do a ton of moderation. And the servers can whitelist and blacklist and do all sorts of things to each other. At the end of the day, there's no, email controller in the sky that can do this. So in a sense, it's kind of pointless to talk about centralized moderation. The flip side of that, of course, is that because there's no centralized moderation, the moderation gets pushed to the nodes, as it were, to the individual servers and providers. And that means that different people can choose different levels of email moderation, right? I'm a normie, so I use Gmail. I'm happy for Gmail to do aggressive moderation and to read my emails. I probably shouldn't be, right? I don't know, but I am, as it turns out. Other people, right, hate this, right? They're all using Proton Mail or whatever it is that they're using. So everyone gets to choose their own level of content moderation. And so what if social media operated in this way, right? What if social media operated in this way? I'm not sure that social media necessarily ought to operate in this way. My point is less normative, like this is what the future should be, than just to say, here, this is a possible future. It's worth taking seriously. And I think it illuminates some stuff. Okay, so let me get a little more specific. What is this Fediverse thing, right? How do you have decentralized social media? So the Fediverse, the word refers to the ecosystem of protocols and then the applications that run on those protocols that together provide functionality equivalent to today's social media, but in a way that's not controlled by any one entity. So we talked about Blue Sky a little bit. That might be the future of this, but for the moment, the most popular Fediverse protocol is called ActivityPub, which has become the de facto standard. Now, what a protocol like ActivityPub tries to do is it tries to take the core experience of all social media, users, content, likes, retweets or republications, however you call it, right? And abstract it away into something that can be used to have a social media experience, no matter the actual details. So on top of ActivityPub, for example, you can have, for example, a variety of different social media applications. So there's PeerTube, for example, which operates like decentralized YouTube. There's Friendica, which operates like decentralized Facebook. PixelFed is Instagram, and they all use the protocol different ways. But the commonality means that one neat feature of the Fediverse is that all of these different applications can interoperate directly. Right. So right now, if you're on Twitter, there's no way to like a Facebook post. It just is. It's not meaningful, right? Because there's just two different worlds. It's not even clear what that would even mean. On ActivityPub, it's actually not that complicated because a PeerTube video is just content like a Friendica, a wall update. So it's a cool way that you can sort of interoperate these things. But the application that I want to talk about today, because it's the most popular, is Mastodon, which is the Twitter clone. It's a microblogging service, right? It's the most popular of these applications. It has something like a few million active users, which of course is nothing compared to Facebook's, 2 billion, but it's not nothing, right? And it's growing quite quickly. In fact, when Elon Musk first announced his bid to buy Twitter, Mastodon's sign-up service crashed because everyone decided to flee to it, right? Now, the key feature here is that there's no central Mastodon service. What there are different what are called instances. You can think of them like email servers, right? And when you sign up for Mastodon, you actually sign up with a Mastodon instance rather than with Mastodon HQ, right? And so when you log into your Mastodon account, what you look at, but all these instances, importantly, can communicate with each other, right? In the same way that email servers communicate with each other. So when you log onto your Mastodon account, you see not only those users that you follow that are on your instance, but also on other instances that your instance talks to, right? Now, in addition to this feature of architecture through instances, you can move from instance to instance while preserving your follower count and information. And this is really key. If I don't like my Facebook, if I don't like Facebook, if I don't like what Zuckerberg is doing, I can leave Facebook. No one is making me use it. And I can go to some other service, but then I have to start from zero, right? And I've lost all the accumulated digital capital I built on Facebook. It's not true with Mastodon. If I don't like Chinny's Mastodon instance, I don't like her moderation, I can move to a SOS Mastodon instance. I keep my username, I keep my followers, I keep all of my content. Now, this is huge because it allows it allows what for what the economic theorist Albert Hirschman called voice. Right? It allows us to actually participate in our governance, because there's always the threat that if we don't like it, we actually can leave. And that threat is credible because the costs of us leaving are not nearly as high as if we were in one of these closed incumbent social media platforms. In addition, it also means that instances, you don't end up with one instance monopolizing everything else, right? The reason, although the network itself has large network effect, which is to say that the bigger the network becomes, the more valuable it is. That's not really the case for instances, because every instance can communicate with every other instance. So if you actually look at the distribution of Mastodon users by instance, you see actually a nice power log distribution where, yes, most of the users are on a few instances, but even the top 5 instances only have something like 80% of the users. And you have a lot of these intermediate sized instances. Now that's still relatively centralized relative to, not a power log distribution, but it's much less centralized than Facebook, where one instance, which is to say Facebook, has by definition 100% of the users. Okay, so that's the architecture of the something like Mastodon. So then how does content moderation work and not work on Mastodon? Well, there are 2 key principles. And again, this is all sort of, which works like email. The email is just, it's a very, very good model for thinking about how this works. So the first principle is that Mastodon can't moderate anything, right? There is no centralized authority. You cannot get rid of any piece of content from Mastodon as a general matter, right? It is not possible. On the other hand, each instance has full control over its servers, which means that each instance controls not just what's on its servers, but also which servers that instance wants to communicate with. And different instances, right, can have more or less content moderation. So while on a global level, you might have less content moderation on something like Mastodon, any individual instance might have much more moderation than you would have even on, let's say, Twitter or Facebook or something like that. So the term I use for this is content moderation subsidiarity, right? Because I'm a law professor and I get paid for coming up with these, it's important to have snappy titles. Right? The idea here being that instead of one global content moderation standard, you push the content moderation standards to the more local communities, and each of those communities can do what they want. So that works fine as a general matter. But one might ask, well, how does Mastodon deal with sort of extreme, quote unquote, threats, to its values? And the best example here has been Gab. And Gab is a Twitter-like social network that is most popular on the far right. And it launched in 2016. And then in 2019, it moved to Mastodon software because for a number of reasons. One, Mastodon actually works very well. It's a well-designed piece of software. And also, it was a way of for Gab to get around the bans that the Google and Apple Play stores had imposed on it. And so, how did Mastodon respond to this right-wing hate spewing platform joining its network? Well, on the one hand, there was no way for Mastodon to expel Gab from the Fediverse. Mastodon's founder, this German engineer Eugene Rochko, he explained kind of pleadingly, you have to understand, it's not actually possible to do anything platform-wide because it's decentralized. I don't have control, right? And what this meant is that no one debated, frankly, this for very long. They just went in, each instance just had to just decide for itself what it wanted to do. Most instances ultimately decide to cut ties with Gab. And some of them even went so far as to cut ties with any instances that had not themselves cut ties with Gab. So you ended up with kind of a, I think in the end, a pretty nice equilibrium where most of the Mastodon community decided they wanted nothing to do with this. And they were able to do that. Like they really were able to firewall themselves off from this thing they didn't like. But Gab was never kicked off the network, right? If you're a Gabber, you can still Gab to other Gabbers, right? I'm assuming that's the verb. Now, at some point, Gab decided to hell with these, I don't know, woke mastodites, actually themselves kind of stopped interoperating with anybody else. So they really are off the network but that's because they've chosen to be off the network, right? And so, and I'll stop in a second. I think this allows us to sort of test our intuitions, right? As someone who is generally on the more free speech side of the spectrum, this to me seems like a pretty decent solution, right? Individuals do not have to expose themselves to stuff that they don't want, right? They can choose to be on an instance that has taken a very hard line against Gab, but at the same time, there's no centralized authority that can make some content, some views, some whatever political provocations disappear from the network. Or at least the network itself can't make it happen, right? An important thing to appreciate is that instances and users are still real hardware in real space, right? Subject to the real jurisdiction of real governments. So if there was an instance, for example, that was trafficking in child pornography, right? It is a downside of Mastodon that you could not get rid of that from the network, except of course the government, right, could go and start putting people in jail. And that I'm actually much more comfortable with. My view has always been that if you're going to go the step of saying such and such content is beyond the pale, that it should never be on any part of the network, that actually should be a decision that a government should make, not some individual who happens to control the network. So again, the point is just, I have more in the paper about other upsides and downsides. I have more in the paper about ways we could encourage the Fediverse and all sorts of policy interventions. But really the point is just to say, there's this thing out there that operates reasonably well. It's growing. It's certainly nowhere to challenging Twitter and Facebook right now, but it appears that Twitter wants to turn into that. And so, it's something that we should think about, and because it is a promising alternative.
Thank you. So we're going to, in a second, open it up to the room for questions, comments on either paper. I do want to pose one question to you, Alan, and that is, first, a descriptive question, just to make sure I understand. What you call the content moderation subsidiarity, see, I'm already using your buzzword. Is that entity identifiable? Is it anonymized or identifiable entity? And can it be liable if it is identified to anyone in under understand the law currently, or how you envision the law?
So there is no entity.
So there is no entity.
That's the whole point.
So who you kept referring to the instance? Who manages the instance?
Oh, so So the instance. So it depends, right? So
Okay.
the instance is just a box, right? It's just a piece of hardware that is running some server software, right? Some Mastodon server software. So it all depends. So right now, Gab has. Mastodon says, so Mastodon has chosen to say that these instances can't be commercial. There's nothing architectural about that. And I suspect that if Mastodon grows, that'll have to stop because you have to make money somehow. So there's a variety of people. Right now, it's basically volunteers, right? It's just people who donate some money and some server space and they do some stuff. So I guess
when you said that the Gab refused to, or that people moved out of the Gab and the Gab continued to operate within the Gab to the Gabbers. Yeah. That was just a collective decisions of the members of Gab without any centralized power within the local box.
No. Okay, yes, I understand your. My apologies. Okay, yeah. So the person who owns the box, the instance, has complete control what happens within the instance, right? They are the dictator of that instance. Now, different instances may choose to have different governance over that instance, right? So some instances might have benevolent dictators, some instances might operate democratically, some instances might have complex legal structures, some instances might be registered as corporations or nonprofits and have their government structures, but the instances are themselves centralized, right? Which is to say,
are they publicly known?
Yes. Yeah. They're out there, right? Okay. The point is that there's no one who sits on top of the instances who can say, you are allowed to be an instance, you are not allowed to be an instance.
Now I get it. Okay. So theoretically speaking, they can be liable if I wanted to say.
Oh, absolutely.
That's the first question I wanted to say. Now the real question. Terrorism. Both of the Supreme Court cases that will deal with content moderation in the next cycle will be about terrorism content. And so far, most of what you talked about is that if you don't want to be exposed to something, this is a solution because then you won't have to be exposed to the thing. But sometimes there are things that society doesn't want to exist. And that's where you said government can regulate. But government has been slow to regulate these things. And part of the problem we're in with content moderation is that as a result, we are stuck with a lot of bad content out there. And even if government regulated, enforcement on scale is hard. And so the reliance on these content moderation systems as automated by the companies is a response to a need. And I'm wondering whether in this system that need goes away somehow, or
no, it doesn't go away. There's a trade-off. I think anyone who says that like I have some magic solution that can figure out content moderation in the perfect way that will get rid of only the bad stuff and not the good stuff is not serious. There is a trade-off. And we all have different priors as to what that trade-off is, right? So if you believe that some form of content, terrorism, child exploitation, sex trafficking, whatever your thing is so bad, right? Is so bad that the only acceptable amount of it is 0, and the collateral speech costs of that are just, it's okay, right? Like trade-offs, right? Then my thing is not for you, right? Then you will not like the Fediverse, and you will oppose the Fediverse, and you should oppose the Fediverse. And I'm totally okay with that. Like that's totally fine, right? And hopefully this is clarified, right, for you, right, why you oppose the Fediverse, right? Europe is actually, what's funny, the Fediverse, Mastodon is a German thing. Or it's kind of a German French. That's where the developers come from. Europe hates this, right? Because they are actually a little more censorious, right? And I'm not here to tell you that the European standards are wrong. I'm a normie American, First Amendment person, right? Just that's the water I grew up in, and is what it is, unfortunately. So I think this is really cool. This satisfies my priors better. But you're absolutely right. If what you're looking for is some sort of turnkey system where I can search for something and eliminate it, this is not for you. This is not for you.
All right, so we're going to take questions from the room. I'm going to hand over moderation powers to Joe because I unfortunately have to go. But this was terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'll see you later.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So if you guys would like, I can happy to do a queue for you.
Yeah.
That would be
Yeah.
helpful.
So Simon, I'm just going to try to go in a row as opposed to first come, first serve. Yeah.
I think I have both questions to
Whatever you'd like to do.
Okay. So the first question for Professor Sharma is we talk about open source software, right? And then the government's role in this. And I think this touches on like how governments, in terms of cyberspace in general, what is the idea of cyberspace? It should be open and free, but then what role should government play? So on that note, are you so I've been thinking about like the government here. Would you also recommend to update the NIST framework? What do you think about SPOM, the software bill of material? And you also mentioned about China. Are there any actions that China did that is not as good or kind of recommendable? Because if you create a law, that means more censorship or more control from the government. But what kind of a model of China that they're doing is something that we can think of? And a question.
Let's do that, and then just to keep it simple.
Okay.
Yeah.
All really great questions. I heard a lot there. To start with the last one first, part of the reason this was concerning and part of the reason I started digging into this is because there is a chance that one of the first entities that learned about Log4Shell was the Chinese government, because there is a national policy that prioritizes the search for open source vulnerabilities, and 2, requires that they be disclosed to the government before they are even disclosed to the affected entity. And so I think that there are a lot of problems with that approach. So, one recommendation I'm definitely not making is mandatory vulnerability disclosure to the government. That being said, there is a national vulnerability database. CVEs are reported to it all the time. That is kind of a voluntary process. There are ways in which we can encourage the contribution of those vulnerabilities specifically for open source. And the reason I think we can tailor this, we can kind of cabin open source here, is because the nature of open source vulnerability disclosure is nearly always inherently public. It is hard to disclose open source to impacted entities because, as I said, we generally don't know who was impacted because we don't know who's using the code. To some degree, it is going to be made public. And so I see more benefit than harm in having that maintained in a centralized location. To your other question, I guess taking all of this backwards about SBOMs, I love the idea. I think that it is something that Alan Friedman has been working on for years and years and years. And I think it has caused a huge paradigm shift in how we think about software. And it's beyond open source. It requires federal contractors and federal agencies to create and demand a software bill of materials that will list out all of the software components, including third-party components, including open source components that they are using, and provide that to their customers. I think this is a great first step, and I think it goes nowhere near far enough. One, it is cabined to federal contractors and federal entities. There are a lot of critical infrastructure entities out there that are not contracting with the federal government. Two, I think that this is something that would probably benefit the ecosystem widely, but you have small to medium-sized businesses that would have no capacity to generate a machine-readable SBOM. And if they obtained a machine-readable SBOM, they wouldn't know how to use it. I think that there's a lot of complexity there. And so it provides information, and it goes one step towards kind of digging into that ecosystem and making it a little bit more transparent, but there's a lot more to be done there. And then I completely forgot your first question.
Oh, the NIST framework.
The NIST framework. So the recent executive order has specifically directed NIST to update its framework, and part of it was to update its approach to open source. And NIST has said open source components can in fact be critical software if they're incorporated in government systems. And so again, that is a limited subset of open source software and does not capture what I consider critical software, which is software that hits all critical infrastructure, much of which is held by the private sector. I think the NIST framework is helpful. It is adopted by the most responsible entities. I am not as worried about the most responsible entities. I am worried about the irresponsible entities. The NIST framework remains voluntary. And so to the extent that it remains voluntary, it will have problems and impact. And there was a recent GAO report just this year that said its voluntariness has been a big barrier to its impact in federal agencies.
And did you have a question for Alan?
Yeah. So for Professor Rozenshtein, so I think under current content moderation process, we have three entities: content moderators, users, and algorithms to help kind of moderate the content. My question is, when it comes to content moderators that these companies currently employ, one of the biggest issues is that they have to review very, very, very harmful content. So just the question is, how do you bear that within this kind of ecosystem that everyone might have to review very harmful content? And if I do not like a community, so the second is, okay, so if I want to get out of the community, and one of the biggest issue of like breaking up Facebook or Twitter is that there might be small polarized social media. So how would you envision a community to be formed in this verse that how many, like, would there be like a lot of polarized small tribes? What would the vision look like?
Yeah. So all excellent questions. So just to give quick answers to them. So first, yeah, I mean, so how, one challenge to the federalists is how does this stuff moderate at scale? And there are a couple of answers to this. One is, yes, it might be that content moderation itself has to be democratized a little bit, and we might all have to volunteer a little bit to review stuff. I'm actually not convinced that that's such a bad thing. It is really bad to be one of these people whose literal jobs it is to sit all day long and look at the most violent and horrible content. It's a bad system, right? And you can tell the companies don't want actually to continue this either, because you just have people working in horrible conditions. So if that burden gets spread out a little bit, I'm not sure that's the worst thing in the world. Now, well, who can do them instead? So there's gonna be a lot of algorithms, right? That's actually very expensive. So one concern is that a small instance might not be able to do that. And the answer there is, you've already seen this a little bit. Instances can outsource their moderation to other folks, right? So you can have, a big instance that has the resources to do this, does content moderation for other instances as well. So those instances end up being sort of like quasi under the umbrella of the big instance. Or you can imagine third-party vendors who step up to do this. So there are ways of, around that, potentially around that problem. As to your other question of, isn't this just going to create a bunch of filter bubbles? The answer is it might, and that might be a bad thing, but also might be an okay thing in the following sense. It's actually not clear, if you look at some of the research, and the research is very preliminary, and it's hard to draw some conclusions from this. It's not clear that the problem that we have is filter bubbles per se, because when you look at the most extreme people with the most extreme views, they actually see a ton of content from the other side. The problem is not that they don't see other people's content, it's that seeing other people's content doesn't actually help. It turns out that if I'm exposed to the worst, craziest version of the other team, right? My response is not usually to say, maybe they have a point. It's to say, wow, those people are awful. And I believe my thing even more, right? There's a version in which one of the original sins, as it were, of let's say something like Facebook, is Mark Zuckerberg's idea, which sounded great at the time, but increasingly sounds dystopian, to create a global community. Because maybe you can't have a global community, right? We are barely evolved chimpanzees, right? It is far from clear that we have the emotional and cognitive wherewithal, right, to interact with 6 billion of our fellow barely evolved primates. And so it actually might be the case that what you need is smaller communities, right? You actually need people to talk to each other less. And that actually may be one reason why content moderation might scale actually okay in the Fediverse. Because if you can do some of the filtering on the front end, which is to say, you have smaller communities in which people understand each other better, and so you have less of the sort of context collapse that causes a lot of problems on Twitter when some tweet from some subculture goes viral and everyone just like misinterprets what it means, and et cetera, et cetera. That might be a way of both addressing the filter bubble concern and also the issue of content moderation. I mean, look, again, you're right? Like every time someone raises a criticism of the Fediverse, the answer is you're 100% correct, right? It's just, like the alternative is this other thing, and which side of the trade-off are you willing to swallow?
Saw some other hand a moment ago. We have 2 minutes left, so go ahead, sir, please.
Okay, just very briefly, regarding mastering Fediverse. Do you feel there is a lot of influence from the Google Usenet? Because younger people don't remember Usenet anymore, but like 30 years ago, it was the social platform there was. It also had those independent servers who could choose or not to choose to carry some news groups and whatnot.
Yeah. I did not spend a lot of time on Usenet, sadly, and it's something that I actually want to learn more about, right? Because, pardon? Yeah. Because I am actually curious to what extent Usenet had already solved this problem. Not quite, right? And I suspect it's in the architectural differences between how Usenet operated and how the Fediverse operates that is kind of the quote unquote sort of secret sauce, right? But yeah, that is something that I am sort of less familiar with.
We have 1 minute left, but let's do one more question. Somebody have one for Chinmayi just to keep things pretty equal here. Yes, so go ahead.
We spoke about open source code as non-excludable, non-rival, and I think you touched upon the potential for it to be something from a free rider problem. I didn't think you said it already does, or if it can in the future. So I guess I'm wondering if you could touch on what may have already led to that, or what may in the future.
The free rider problem, I think, is one of the more intuitive parts of it. It's free, so why would I invest in it? There's no fee structure. Open source licenses decidedly do not call for compensation for use of their code. That being said, there are a lot of ways that companies can support open source. They can provide funding, they can provide hands-on keyboard developer support, and they can provide organizing efforts. Open source is very diffuse, and sometimes organization is a big problem for these projects. There are companies that are doing this. Not all companies are free riders. Google, Microsoft, Intel, they've dedicated quite a bit of funding. Some of their developers are 100% dedicated to open source. They are organizing their own open source projects to make sure that a project that is very important to the ecosystem is well structured. That is the kind of support that I think should be happening. And the free rider problem is just to say, if I have a small startup and I'm using open source, and I know that Google cares a whole lot about this project that I'm using, I can bank on the fact that they're going to take care of it because they have a larger risk surface and more to lose. And so I just free ride off of that effort and don't put in my share. And then just from an economic perspective, that's an inefficient allocation of resources and just unsustainable in the long run.
So I think this conversation is amazing, and I would love to keep it going all day, but I want to be respectful of people's times. And so two last things. One, our last talk for this semester is in November 10th, digitizing voter disenfranchisement with Margaret Hu from William & Mary Law School. And then also, please give a nice round of applause for our excellent speakers tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for having us.